In this video, we will talk about organizational culture. This video is based on Chapter 3 in Educational Administration Concepts and Practices, published in 2011 by Lunenburg and Ornstein at Cengage Learning. So we will begin by discussing the definition of organizational culture. Then we will move on to talking about whether culture is uniform across an organization, and we will discuss subcultures and dominant culture. So the idea of an organizational culture started to be discussed first as early as the Hawthorne studies, when they noticed that there is work group culture at a workplace. So the real, boom in studying organizational culture took place in the 1980s when a lot of books were published on organizational culture. One of the very famous ones was written by Deal and Kennedy and called Corporate Cultures. There was another book, Theory Z, by William Uchi, and In Search of Excellence by Tom Peters and Robert Waterman. So these books and others, they popularized the concept of organizational culture, and researchers of administrative studies, they began to study this topic. So basically at the beginning, the theorists had spent a lot of effort on showing that an organizational culture is a real thing, right? It might be hard to imagine, but in the beginning, it took a while to convince people that organizations have, almost like they have personalities like people, right? For example, organizations can be, flexible or rigid, supportive or unfriendly, etc. Okay, so when you tell someone about where you work, you tend to often really describe what is organizational culture, right? The kinds of people who work with you, the atmosphere at your workplace on a regular day, the facilities and how you feel the organization treats the employees. An important indicator of an organizational culture is the definition of success adopted in this organization. Okay, so all these things kind of describe what organizational culture is. The more or less adopted definition of an organization's culture is all its beliefs, feelings, behaviors, and symbols that are characteristic of it. Okay, so there are other definitions of organizational culture, but if we look at least most of them, they will be describing 6 characteristics of organizational culture. Okay, the first characteristic would be observed behavioral regularities, and this is about things that we could observe when we see the members of an organization interact between each other, right? So the language that they use, the terminology, the rituals, and the ceremonies, how they treat each other, okay? The second characteristic of an organizational culture would be norms, and this relates basically to the standards of behavior that the people in the organization consider acceptable or maybe typical. And so the third characteristic is dominant values. In an organization, typically its members share major values. For example, in schools, all teachers might be committed to high performance of teachers and students. They are committed to making sure that students do not miss classes, that they do not drop out, and that overall there is high efficiency of what they do. The fourth characteristic of an organizational culture is philosophy. Basically, the policies that guide an organization's beliefs about how you want to treat people who work for you and the clients you serve. Okay, so we could find philosophies often in statements of philosophy or mission statements. Some schools, school districts have this kind of documents on their websites. The fifth characteristic of an organizational culture is rules. Okay, usually organizations have guidelines, things that describing things that, for example, a new member must learn in order to be accepted. Okay. Finally, the sixth characteristic of an organizational culture is feelings. Feelings really refers to the overall atmosphere that can be felt and conveyed, which is usually conveyed through physical layout, and you can also observe that in how the organization members interact with outsiders. Okay, so really, one thing to keep in mind is that none of these characteristics by itself, they represent the essence of organizational culture. Really, when we talk about culture is when we talk about all these six things, right? When all these characteristics are taken collectively, right? That is what gives meaning to organizational culture. And the culture of an organization is really interrelated with most concepts in educational administration, such as organizational structures, leadership, decision making, etc. So here is figure 3.1 from chapter 3 in Linenberg and Ornstein, and you can see that here basically what we can see is that this organization, abstract organization, receives inputs, right? Basically, through inputs, an organization imports energy in the form of information, people, and materials, right? Then those inputs go through administrative processes, including motivation, leadership, decision making, communication, and change, and through organizational structures that include job descriptions, selection systems, evaluation systems, control systems, reward systems, right? And all these things are processed in, the inputs are processed through the transformation process, at the heart of which is culture, organization's culture, including behavioral regularities, philosophy, rules, feelings, values, and norms, things that we just talked about, right? So basically, administrative processes and organizational structures have a significant impact on organizational culture, and also culture impacts administrative processes and organizational structures, right? So after this transformation process, at the heart of which is organizational culture, and administrative processes and organizational structures, we get the output, right? So the output in the form of students' knowledge, for example, if we're talking about schools, skills of students attitudes, their attendance, dropout, and other performance criteria. Okay, so you can also see that these lines here are dashed. So this line kind of separates the organization, the school, from its external environment. And because this is dashed, that implies that, an organization not only is influenced by the external environment, right, but it also influences it. So that is something to keep in mind. So we talked about how culture represents the organization's cumulative learning. and it is reflected in organizational structures, people, administrative processes, and the external environment, even because organizations also interact and impact the external environment, right? So this culture perpetuates beliefs and behavior, and it specifies the aims and the mission of an organization. At the same time, culture is not uniform, especially in large organizations, right? Those big organizations typically don't have single homogeneous beliefs, values, and behavior patterns, and that is because of two reasons. First, you know there are usually differences between the formal culture and the informal culture, right? So the formal culture describes the ideal philosophy of an organization, right? And the informal culture represents the actual manifestations of that philosophy, actually things that actually take place in real life. So there's usually differences between those two cultures, formal and informal, in large organizations. The second reason is that in different functional groups there might be different cultures, and those are called subcultures, right? And so the informal culture and the different cultures in various functional groups can be called subcultures. And basically, this really is about this concept of a subculture, is really describing this fact that whenever some task requires certain things which require such as unique combinations of people, structures, and function, really the requirement to fulfill the group's goals results in a unique culture. Okay, and those unique cultures could be are often referred to as subcultures. At the same time, in addition to those subcultures that may exist in a large or even a small organization, right? Most large organizations typically have a dominant culture, which is a culture that distinguishes them from other large organizations, right? So, for example, no matter how big, a large school district, for example, could really be committed to innovation, and you could really see how that really reflects in a variety of practices such as team teaching, scheduling, various programs, teacher advisor programs, how collaborations with the industry takes place in terms of organizing internships, for example. And one could probably see good interpersonal relations between students and teachers in such a large organization, right? So that can happen, and that happens, and if an entire large organization, in this case a large school district, has a philosophy of innovation, right? So that would be an example of how a dominant culture really shapes even large organizations and distinguishes them from other large systems.